Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on battling AI bias in the classroom. I'm Sasha Ramirez, the OECD Education and Skills Communications Manager. As AI systems become more and more widespread, so do the examples of them exemplifying and perpetuating bias. There's the famous example of Google's Gemini system, which generated images of racially diverse Nazi soldiers. There's a US court algorithm that falsely said that Black offenders were more than twice as likely to reoffend than white offenders. Or there's Amazon's recruitment system, which favored men over women. Education systems aren't immune to bias either, and as AI use in the classroom becomes more widespread, so do the risks. But there are things that can be done, and today I'm here to talk to an expert panel about some of the issues around AI bias in the classroom and some of the solutions. So let me introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Tiera Tanksley, a 2024 MacArthur and Op-Ed Fellow and a UCLA postdoctoral fellow in youth technology and public policy. There's Jeremy Roschelle, the Executive Director of Learning Sciences Research at Digital Promise. Dr. Eleanor Drage, a Senior Research Fellow at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge University. And finally, Stéphane Vincent-Lancant, a Senior Analyst and Deputy Head of the Center for Educational Research and Innovation at the OECD. Let's start off with Stéphane, who's going to walk us through some of the key findings related to artificial intelligence bias from the 2023 Digital Education Outlook. Over to you, Stéphane.
So let me thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. And so I just wanted to, show a little bit where this is coming from and what we've been doing on that topic at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. We've started with basically the opportunities of AI. And so we had the first OECD Education Outlook in 2021, which was very much about a lot of the opportunity that are already there and that we could possibly seize. And some of them actually really relate to how to make education more equitable and fair. And sometimes, by correcting human bias. So here, for example, that's an example of classroom analytics that tells teachers where they have been sitting, basically, or where the attention has been turned to during a classroom, and so here you can see on that example, for example, that it was mainly on the left-hand side of the classroom, and perhaps that was the right thing to do, and perhaps it wasn't. And so, people get a lot of feedback to possibly change their behavior, and that particular day perhaps assist everyone. We have a lot of other tools like, preventing dropout, early warning system that allow to put in place interventions for students at risk of, dropping out or having difficulties. And that's really one of the possibilities and opportunities of AI in education. But we know that all these algorithms also have some possible issues. And, you have a lot of different books coming from the US mainly on, how, in fact, in spite of the opportunities, one of the risks is that the bias is becoming systemic or systematic, because it's automated by an entrenching an algorithm. So that's really what we're trying to understand, so what are the implications for governments of, for these new types of risk? And so we actually had a second edition, which came December, which focuses much more on the infrastructure that countries are giving to schools, teachers, and students in, the OECD area. And also, how they govern digital education. And so one of the aspects is how they govern equity, etc. We have a specific chapter in that report on algorithmic bias. And, one way to define it is probably to say that, there is bias when there is a systematically better or lower algorithmic performance. In some cases, we want it, but, the problem is really when it leads to some harm, some discrimination against either one person or subpopulation group. And you can see on the left-hand side, I'm not going to go through it, all the different possible sources of biases. One of them is actually in the data that have been collected historically and the categories that we've had historically, but it can happen at all different levels of the AI process. And so that's really one of the things to keep in mind, including, in fact, when the information is given to the human beings, and that's what the last step of deployment bias is, basically how this is actually applied and used in practice. And basically, there are two big types of harm that come from biases. One is basically allocative harm. So it's basically when you not everyone has the same opportunities because of bias, and I get back to that. And another one, which is important, is basically representational harms, and so how it kind of stigmatizes or presents in a negative light some groups, or never present them in a positive light because of the information that's coming from that. And some of the things that are around, the search engines are typically more related to these representational harms. And I would say that many of the ones that we're talking in education are more allocative harms, so things that prevents people from getting all the opportunity that they should have. So, I really engage you to have a look at, the chapter 9 of the Digital Education Outlook 2023, which is a chapter by Ryan Baker, Aaron Hone, and Cian Lee, and basically where they provide a few definitions on bias and show that what is research, in which types of areas. It's basically how to support academic achievement and predict dropout, failure, cases of automated essay scoring or speech evaluation, etc. And what types of biases have been already demonstrated and documented in the case of education. So in the US, where most of the research comes from, it's very much around the question of race. And in fact, there are a lot of cases showing that many of the solutions or the systems that are being used in education are less effective for Blacks and Hispanics than for white and Asian students. And also that you have, that it's often difficult to mitigate. Outside the US, a lot of the research has been on nationality or citizenship of the students, and usually showing that it's more difficult for people who are not from, where the country, where the study, the country of the study has been done. A few things around gender, but with sometimes positive, sometimes negative biases for boys or for girls, and a few studies for many other subcategories, but actually too few to draw any kind of conclusion. And so here really more research is needed, and that's about indigenous populations, rural-urban divides, non-native language speakers, special needs, and students with disability, and that's really an important one. In the case of the US, military-connected students, etc. There was actually one research that came out a few days ago and in IRA Open, and basically showing that studying, with different types of machine learning algorithms, how they could actually be used to predict success in higher education for different groups, and showing basically that a lot of these different techniques using widely known datasets in the US underpredict success and overpredict failure for Black and Hispanic students, and also that the researchers have tried to mitigate these things with different techniques, and that proved to be very difficult for these particular groups. So that's something which is very current at present, and that we really need to address. Currently, this is not the case. There are no country that we have surveyed last year that had anything in place in terms of measures. Of course, people have laws, countries have laws on equity and fairness and against discrimination, but nothing that is specifically targeted towards algorithmic bias at this stage. And so that's really one of the things that people should be considering. So here are some of the recommendations that Ryan Baker and colleagues have done as part of their chapter. And basically one, which I believe is very important, is really how to balance algorithmic bias with privacy policy, just to make it possible to identify bias, and so make sure that everything doesn't stay in the green box that you see here, the unknown bias, and so have much more research on that, make sure that, there are a variety of categories that are being researched and that they are actually related to local context and local equity concerns. So at this stage, even so there is a lot of discussion, including in Europe and in other countries, about algorithmic bias. Almost all of the research is actually carried out in the United States or by US researchers, even for what's going on elsewhere. And so that's really one of the concerns, and where we want to see a little bit more progress in the coming years. a lot of it actually to make it more, there are a few practical tools that are that should be available for researchers and for developers to actually check algorithmic bias. And so here perhaps there is a role for governments to actually fund the development of this kind of toolkit that could be used by a large group of people, and also just to fund research on this unknown and actually known biases around the world. Last point I wanted to mention with Education International, which is a federation of teacher unions, the global federation of teacher unions. We have actually designed 9 opportunities, guidelines, and guardrails, and perhaps there will be a chance to come back on that. One of them is about ethics, safety, and data protection. And you can see that, there was an agreement to have something, to really address algorithmic bias and make sure that privacy and data protection also takes into account other objectives, such as equity or the effectiveness or the performance of the different AI tools. And to keep in mind that it actually requires often the collection of personal data, including sometimes sensitive ones. So that's really something that is important. And perhaps I'd like to draw your attention to the last point, which is related to what I mentioned before, the deployment bias, that it is also very important that once we get information from these AI tools, there is no stigmatization or bad use based on the information that is actually provided by these different tools. And that's true for teachers or for students. And so, there is really an ethical dimension to that as well. So I really look forward to the discussion. And, if you haven't seen yet, or if you see digital education out of 2023, I engage you to have a quick look. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stefan. Really interesting introduction. I think, so many different dimensions to this issue, from the fact that we need data to understand, to build AI models, but at the same time, we need to collect data, but then we also don't want to harm privacy protections, issues around internationalization, the fact that it's so dominated by certain countries, and do we need new regulations? Do we need new laws, or can we adapt existing things? And I think, Jeremy, that's something that I know you're an expert in, and eager to hear from you later on about that topic. But why don't we turn to the panelists now? Jeremy, maybe I'll start with you. Walk us through some of your own thinking about the nature and implications of bias in education. Where has that taken you?
Yeah, thanks. Stefan, thanks for the excellent opening remarks. And it's really exciting to see all the places the participants in this webinar come from. So many countries represented. So just great to be here. I'm just going to follow on Stefan by giving some examples to ground us in what bias really looks like. And I want to point out it's not just AI. So let me just start with personalized learning. If I was in a lecture hall, I'd ask you all to raise your hands. How many of you have used a personalized learning system or recommended one? And I would bet I would get a lot of hands up. And in my research, some of those systems that are weaker do the following. They look at the student's work, and if the student's not making very much progress or is getting wrong answers, they may slow down the learning for that system and move them backwards in the curriculum. And they may speed up learning for a student who is doing well, accelerating their progress through the curriculum. And let's just think about that for a second. If you take the students who are ahead and speed them up, and you take the students who are struggling and slow them down, it seems kind of inevitable that you're increasing gaps between the learners. And that's a real problem. Do we want any technology, AI or not, to operate with an algorithm that actually is increasing the gaps between those who enter our system with stronger or weaker knowledge? Cheating comes up a lot, and we've seen a lot of cases where algorithms falsely identify at higher rates students of color or students who don't speak English as their first language as more likely to be cheating. And so they are flagging students for discipline at a higher rate. Later, I'll talk more about civil rights in the United States, but that could be a violation of civil rights laws in the US if you're flagging students for discipline. Representational bias, we've all seen examples from Google where in their attempt to be equitable, they actually sometimes produce false historical images that are laughable and just have the wrong colors of faces for those historical incidents. And I also want to point out interactional bias, that the way a system conversationally interacts with a learner may be appropriate for a dominant group, but could be hurtful to a different group who that interactional style is not good for them. Okay, so you wanted me to talk about implications, and let me just say briefly, I think we have to imagine the kinds of systems of the future, not just today. So one way to frame this conversation is that we're thinking in our brain about a student directly interacting with a large language model. And I don't think that's where the future is going to take us. I believe we're engineering complicated educational products and systems where LLMs are going to be used in lots of different points and generative AI in lots of different points of that system. Engineering, I went to engineering school as an undergraduate. Engineering is the process of taking components that are prone to failure and imperfect and figuring out how to make them work systemically well together. And so when we think about bias, we're not just going to be thinking about what's wrong with the data in the base generative AI model, but we're going to be thinking throughout the chain. For example, I'll just give you one now. Is there some sort of red teaming process where educators are coming together to work with a proposed product and try to make it do something that's harmful to see if it will? And that kind of process is a very human process that doesn't go all the way back to the data, but could be involved, give information to an engineering process. So I think the implications are we have to realize that the base models are flawed and that we have tools as a society to work with flawed components and make them perform in ways we find acceptable. That's called engineering. And I'll close my opening remarks right there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jeremy. Really interesting. There's a couple of points I want to come back on, especially with respect to civil rights, with respect to how we can build those data models and how red teaming can help us get there. But first, I want to turn to Dr. Tanksley to give us her perspectives on how these issues have actually manifested in some of her own research, what she's seen on the ground, and how she's been thinking about that. Dr. Tanksley, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here. So my research looks at algorithmic racism, specifically algorithmic anti-Blackness here in the US context, and how artificial intelligence systems mediate the lives and schooling experiences of Black youth. So I am also a classroom educator on top of being a researcher. So there's this nice connection, I think, that's important between practice and theory. So one of the things I noticed in a computer science classroom, for example, were some of the technologies we were using in order to advance equity had some almost like invisible downsides for students of color. So I'll give an example. We used Scratch, which is an incredible program to help students learn how to code. And it's really accessible. It's like user-friendly. I mean, it is the go-to, right, for teaching computer science. And there's been a lot of research on how Scratch is one of the ways we increase access to computer science for historically marginalized youth, right? It increases engagement, things like that. Now, when I was teaching with Scratch, I noticed that there was one group of Black girls who I was a researcher in a classroom at this time, and they were tasked with making a Scratch story to represent their lives, right? Their everyday lives. And they found at the time that there weren't enough avatars to actually represent their lives. So even though the goal of the class or the goal of the assignment was to use this program to learn some basic coding skills and kind of like nestled in this, this engaging project of tell us a story about your life, but that actually limited them immediately from being able to learn, right, the coding techniques because they actually could not access avatars that looked like them or that told their story. Now, here's the interesting thing. They had the opportunity to upload their own pictures. And so they did that, right? They started actually tinkering with the Scratch system to make it more culturally relevant. But we found that their projects continued to crash, right? And this happened over and over again. And we could not identify at the time, right? I think this was like 2018. We could not figure out why their projects in particular were crashing. And so lo and behold, these students are doing more work. They're coming in at lunch. They're coming in after school. They're taking their school computers home, right? Because they don't have their own devices to do it at home and nothing is working. And so they ended up failing their assignment, right? So, and the other students who didn't have to upload additional data, right, didn't have to go out and augment that system, passed within they turned it in one class session, right? So for me, I then researched, well, what's going on? It ended up being that, Scratch wasn't at the time necessarily able to maintain that much data storage, right? So it's kind of like a glitch. I don't think maybe we didn't assume that students would have to add so much extra stuff to their projects. And so it's kind of like this, again, this invisible sort of like oversight that ended up having some real emotional and academic consequences, right? Where those girls actively failed a project and reduced their engagement. So that's like one example. But there's so many others. Those girls were also regularly surveilled by the technologies in the schools. There's other classes, or there's other research that I do on like predictive analytics. I know you covered some of these already, but a lot of our tools are designed to identify students who are at risk, right? And time and again, the students who are identified as at risk are low-income Black and Brown students. And the way that technologies kind of create this self-fulfilling prophecy, I think is really important. So a student is identified as a future problem, and then they are typically treated that way, right? Whether or not they actually are a problem. And we also need to really unpack how we're defining a student who's a problem, right? When you're identified already, you're coded as a problem, then your teachers start to treat you that way. And the school's security officers start to treat you that way, right? And so it's really important, I think, to interrogate the values that we attach to these systems. And the last one I'll give you is about ChatGPT. People love ChatGPT. It's kind of like the hottest thing, right? And I think it's important to recognize that specifically for ChatGPT-4, research came out earlier this year that said that as we scale these models, right, that implicit racism, especially anti-Black racism, actually becomes significantly higher. And so in the newest ChatGPT-4 model, right, they found that the levels of anti-Black racism were higher than any period of anti-Black racism experimentally recorded, as high as before the Civil Rights Movement. And they found that when AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, is used, that ChatGPT-4 is actually more likely to not only recommend lower jobs, right, harsher punishment, but it's also more likely to recommend the death penalty. These are the same systems we're using in schools, and these are the same systems that are, informing our suggestions for students and helping us determine, how can we support our students with disabilities, right? If the base model has dangerous outputs like that, right, I think there's more work that we need to be doing around that before we're implementing that in schools.
Thanks so much. I think really, really fascinating. And I love that you brought up this last point that, ultimately we're basing these things off very few large language models, very few big models. And if there are flaws in the models themselves, then, that will obviously lead to flawed outcomes. And I'm also curious to know, and I also like the point about, passing on the burden to students who have to then bear the kind of cost of the AI bias and have to also bear the cost of kind of addressing the issues themselves. So I think those are really interesting points to come back to. But I want to bring in Eleanor now, who I know has done some really interesting work on the recruitment side, because, we're obviously always interested in linking education to outcomes as well. And I know you've done a lot of thinking around and a lot of research on the relationship between AI recruitment tools, which you've called automated pseudoscience, which I absolutely love, and to expose some of the flaws in AI systems. So maybe you can walk us through some of that thinking.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today with experts in the field. And I think that that's what's lacking in the creation of these tools. Very few of them consult students, very few of them consult education experts. And so while a lot of the people developing the tools are quite well-meaning, they really do intend to diversify the workforce. And I've listened to lots of interviews with these people, and they're very nice. They're just totally ill-experienced. They don't know what race and gender is. These are things that people learn over time. Been doing gender studies for 15 years, still wondering what it is that gender actually is. We need to take these ideas very seriously when we're building tools that are now classified as high risk, thankfully, by the EU. And I did a really interesting project with some second-year computer science students at Cambridge who I expected to have to tell, this is what gender is, this is what race is, this is how it relates to hiring. And they were like, no, we don't. This is nonsense because we know that computer science, that AI cannot strip race and gender from a candidate's profile, which is what some of these tools were suggesting. That word strip was actually used by Sensia, one such tool. These candidates wanted to be loved by recruiters. They wanted to be seen generously. They wanted to be interviewed by people who understood where they were coming from, really common sense stuff. And, I've talked to loads of recruiters over the years, and they say, the best recruiters say, of course that tools can't do this, but the advertising is so convincing. What these tools are claiming that they can do, even people who know about AI think, oh, actually, is that possible? So we really need to clamp down on misleading advertising. We really need to do better participatory design involving experts into every stage of the process. And I actually just came off now doing videos for a tool that I'll talk to you about, I think, in another question, that is helping companies building AI tools respond to the EU AI Act's obligations. And one of the things we're keen to say is, if AI isn't suitable, please find an exit door. And we are creating ways to lead companies down the let's not do the AI route, let's do it differently. We can automate it in a different way, or perhaps this problem doesn't need automating at all. Or you can use AI to your advantage. AI is very good at pointing out biases as well as introducing them. So we're working with this AI company called Amagamma, who are this kind of, avant-garde, quite radical AI company based in Italy. And their tagline is no such thing as AI. So we thought, great, why not partner with them? And they've been guiding companies that wanted to create workforce assessment tools or education assessment tools that decide whether candidates, whether students are doing well. Instead of deciding whether they're doing well, which of course is, as you've all said, will only align with past biases because AI can never be neutral. Instead, it's saying, actually, look at how you're doing your assessment. These are where you're likely to become biased in your assessment processes. So if you're desperate to use AI, there are ways of doing it to point out things that humans are doing that are prejudicial. But we've got to be really clear to companies what AI can and can't do at this point.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I especially like your point, do we actually need AI? Reminds me of the blockchain discussion that we had a couple of years ago when all of a sudden everything had to be done through blockchain. And in fact, no, a lot of things actually shouldn't be done through blockchain. And it feels like that's where we are a little bit today. So Stefan, I want to go back to you. I mean, a lot of I think of what people have said have kind of, the kind of feeling is a little bit that we're at a kind of frontier moment right here with AI. And that actually corporate interests and others are moving AI into every aspect of life. And actually, it's moving faster than regulation. It's moving faster than participatory development, as Eleanor mentioned, and this is actually resulting in some of the bias that we're seeing. So, what are some of the implications of this kind of frontier moment that we're in right now for AI?
Well, I think that we've heard some of it, that we are kind of struggling, not to be fully sure whether what we should use, when, etc. I think perhaps one of the things we have to keep in mind is that there are a lot of different types of AI, so we tend to call AI everything. What Jeremy has mentioned, some of the personalized learning system, adaptive learning system are, use AI techniques, but totally different genre from ChatGPT and the large language models. And so, we have to, and probably, the way to check bias in all these different things is a bit different. What I would want to say is probably that, one of the things that we need to do is to use it. So it's very difficult to say, oh, let's wait until it's perfect, so that we can use it. So we have to use it, but we really have to mitigate the risk and to be very systematic in trying to do that. One thing we need to keep in mind is that there is human bias too, so it's not just, bias is not just algorithmic. And sometimes, in fact, the algorithms and automation system help to mitigate human bias and can actually, be better. So Tiera has shown some examples where actually it can make things worse. And, that's, but in other cases, it can make things better for, minoritized populations, etc. And so, we have to be careful about how to be, balanced in that, and we need to research it. As I've mentioned, in the intro, and that's probably certainly more of a message for, our colleagues in Europe, where I would say the privacy and data protection angle kind of is the main one, in everybody's mind, we have to think that, there are new risks that appear with, these new tools, and that we need to be able to investigate, So some of the things that you've mentioned, Tiera cannot be researched in some countries, because we cannot have information about all the different subgroups, etc. And so we have to think in a bit more innovative way on how to think about that, if really we want to take equity and fairness seriously. And so I think that's really one of the important implications of all these different things. It's a very small addition. So, Jeremy mentioned, in his first example, how some of the systems will advantage, students doing better and actually sometimes widen the achievement gap between different groups, let's say the low achievers and high achievers. And Jeremy has actually conducted several studies on some of the systems showing that it is not a fatality. Sometimes it can actually close the achievement gap as well. And perhaps that's some of the things that we want to see, And so here we don't call that bias, but this is a kind of differentiated performance that is welcome. And so in some cases, we actually are looking for that, and we can use technology for that purpose. So that's really, so I don't have Sasha, the final answer to what you're saying, but, we have a lot of new questions that are new for policymakers and that we need to think about, and not just think about, but do something about, and so that's a current challenge we're in.
Thanks so much, Stefan. So I do want to turn now to looking at some of the strategies that we can use to mitigate AI bias. And let me start with you, Dr. Tanksley. One of the things you've called for is a coalition between big tech and regulators. What would this look like in your view? And what makes you think that we can actually align those views together to achieve good outcomes?
So I think that is a complicated question, because I do think that there is, historically, I don't think there's a lot of examples where corporate interests have aligned with activists in ways that, probably are perfect for me. So I am skeptical that they will be as fruitful as, one would hope, but I do think it's necessary. I think that these companies are in our schools already. I think that the leaders of these companies are working directly with politicians to shape educational policy in ways that support corporate and profit interests. And so it's kind of like you have to play the game, right? So if we're going to have AI in our schools, how do we demand systems that are equitable for all students and not just a small subset of students, right? So I think thinking through like a business model, like we're the consumers, right? And education has been identified as like the new frontier, right, for AI, because there is so much, like untapped monetary gain in education, right? Like in the US, like our budget is pretty lofty for ed tech. And if we're an audience, I think that is of huge interest to big tech. And so I think if we look at it from that, I think we can put our demands, like we can center our demands, like we're not going to use technologies that actively harm our students in these particular ways. So how do you design better tools? Here's our expectations, right? I think though, we need to raise awareness around what are the harms. I have found that one of the ways kind of big tech gets into our schools ahead of time is because they are a consolidated source of knowledge And there's this belief that you only know about AI if you design AI, right? And you can't be an academic who designs AI. You have to actually be an industry professional who does AI. So there's all of these like hierarchies, right? These elitist hierarchies that are built into our notions of technology and intelligence, that end up actually disenfranchising the very voices that we need at the forefront of thinking about AI in education. So I want to see collaborations with students. I want to see them with parents and elders, right? Why do we not have our grandparents involved in these conversations in our schools? So many of our young people, myself included, were raised by our grandparents, right? And so if my grandmother can't figure out this Ed the chat bot, right, that Los Angeles Unified is using, which has its own, issues, then what's going on, right? If my family can't advocate for me when I am identified as a problem by these systems, right, and they don't even know what technologies are embedded into my school device, right, that are connected to law enforcement, that result in law enforcement coming up to my house, right, because that's a real thing that's been happening, there's no way for them to advocate for us. And so I think we need to see more diversity, but more than representational diversity in these coalitions, right? Experiential diversity, intellectual diversity, right? Ideological diversity. And I want to see folks who are like the non-traditional, like who you wouldn't think would be on a panel for AI in education, right? Like I'm thinking of formerly and currently incarcerated folks, right? I'm thinking about survivors. I'm thinking about folks who are unhoused, right? Those are the people who are the most dominated by these technologies and impacted in our schools, right? So many of our students are actually unhoused, they're foster youth, right? They're undocumented. They've experienced the carceral web, whether it was themselves or a family member, right? Those are the people who have the most to lose from these technologies, only working for like the ideal user, and they need to be included in these conversations. They need to lead these conversations in our schools. But I think that on top of that, again, we need to be able to raise awareness because so many folks just have no idea what technologies are doing, what data is being collected, where that data goes, what industries are connected to these platforms, all of this. So I think there is kind of like this two-sided approach.
Thanks so much. Jeremy, I wonder if you want to react to any of that. I know you've questioned also the role, and I think Eleanor, you also mentioned this as well, is that people working in tech often don't know. They simply don't know the questions asked. They don't know the answers, certainly. And so, Jeremy, I wonder if you want to bring some of your experience in this aspect as well. How do we bring in the right people that know, and as Dr. Tanksley said, experiential diversity in a way that's not tokenistic, and bring in diversity of perspectives to the table as well? How can we do those things?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk and share. Well, there's two things I hear from my colleagues that I really love, and I just want to get 100% behind. One is we're only going to solve this with AI literacy that is empowering everyone to understand AI so they can be part of the decision process. And second, co-design, participatory design, getting the right people at the design table is essential. 100%. I'm going to make three additional points. With regard to the companies, I've been doing a bunch of work in support of our US Department of Education, and it involved a lot of listening sessions where we listen to companies. And my first point is the common value that can bind us together is they want trust. It's a much better market for them just to be, capitalistic and crass if there's trust in the market. So that's a motivator. And to build trust, we have to create high standards of what conversation. So trust can't be, oh, Stefan, I like you. You're a nice person. I enjoy dinner with you. I'll buy your system. Trust has to be more precise. Have you taken steps to identify and mitigate bias in your system? Tell me about those steps. Show me the documentation. Okay, number one, trustworthy conversations are going to be the core of this. Number two, research is key, and there's a problem there. The research that we need to do involves knowing personal identifiable information about the students. If we want to protect students who have a disability or have less income or are students of color, we need to be able to do research where we know that about the students. And it's gotten very hard to get access to that data in schools. And so we have to really think hard about how to motivate a research climate where we can study these questions and understand if the system, and there's a very provocative article out there by a colleague, Lawrence Holt. I will put it in the chat later, where he argues that a lot of the personalized learning systems are showing benefits, but only to the top 5% of the better off 5% of students. So they're not showing benefits for everyone. Well, it's hard to know these things if we can't get the data. So we have to focus on enabling the research. Research can be the way we find out and create knowledge about what's going on. The last one I'll say is extremely practical, but extremely important. Slow down. The companies want us to be in a race. They want us to be adopting every new thing the minute it comes off the shelf. There's no reason for that. There's no evidence that these things are so beneficial that everyone has to start using them immediately, except maybe to explore and for the AI literacy purpose. We need a concerted effort by governments, policymakers, educational leaders to make it okay to slow down. And what that slow down enables is to get back to my earlier point, the thoughtful engineering, thoughtful procurement. Just slow down is be one of my basic messages. So I'll stop there. I love the AI literacy. I love the co-design. I want to ask people if they want to work with developers, focus on trust as a reason to work together, enabling research, and just slowing down.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. I think almost every, or perhaps every education conference that I've been to in the last year has been sponsored almost entirely by tech companies, AI, ed tech companies. So I think that's telling, and I think that's the pace that they want to be at. But I fully take your points about slowing down, building in trust, and not just with us, but actually the people, as Dr. Tanksley said, the people who are most impacted by these things, bringing those voices to the table. Stefan, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is about really the data sets that we're using. And talk us through some of the implications of the diversity of data sets and what we can do there to reduce AI bias, focusing on those aspects.
Thanks, Sasha. So perhaps before I go to that, let me say that on co-creation and co-design, that's really one of the principles that we put forward to at the OECD, and we have a chapter on that in our digital education outlook, and that's really one of the recommendations we agreed on with Education International. So that's a very important point. And we need to see how to make it work, because in fact it's easier to say than to do in many cases, as we can see. But yeah, that's a very important point. So on the diversity of data sets, so basically, what is important is to be able to collect some of the data to check whether there is bias or not. Doesn't mean that it has to be collected for every single point and that we need to, but there should be some ways to actually verify. So to follow up on what Jeremy said, it's important to trust, but also to verify. And to verify, you need to have access to the information. Some people have, to be able to do it. We have to talk about the conditions in which these things could happen, whether it is something for just a few, are we willing to have information about a subset of the data, but we need to be able to have that information so that we can see how the different tools perform for different groups, which have to be defined locally. And so we need to collect that information. So to go back to, the question of which data are collected and where they go, etc. Well, in fact, at least in OECD countries, most countries have pretty strong data protection and, regulation. So it's very well regulated what can be collected, how it can be used by companies, etc. And I think that it's interesting because in the US too has a few regulations, but it's where you hear people are much less sure about whether there is enforcement or not of these different types of regulation. And perhaps we need to, and it's true that in most countries what we find is that there is no proactive enforcement, of these. It has just to be. So we have to think about mechanisms that will create the trust, because there are some independent people who will from time to time be able to have a look. Second point, which relates with the data sets and the commercial entities, we need also to think a little bit more about how to share the data and how to learn from what other people have been doing. If we keep in mind that a lot of these data are well, collected in public spaces, public schools in many cases, with public money. And so it is not necessarily, problematic that some of this information can actually be used publicly by other people, and that, so in many other sectors, there is a discussion about that, how to make, at least some subset of the information that are collected by vendors available to their competitors, so that they can also develop these kind of models. Perhaps we need to start thinking about these types of models in the case of education as well. And I don't think that there is much progress on that, and that it's not yet so much part of the discussions around the use and share of data. But I think that's an important one to think about.
Thanks so much, Stefan. Just to say, we've got people here with us today from over 80 countries, so these international aspects of the whole discussion are really important. We're getting lots of questions about gender, and for that reason, Dr. Eleanor, I want to ask you about feminist AI. I know this is something you've written about. So what is feminist AI, and why should we implement it?
Well, I want to respond to that, but then firstly, there was a few things that I wanted to get to before I forget. The first one is that if the AI isn't oriented towards the most marginalized, don't bother. Because I think there's a lot of comments in the chat about that are asking great questions about balancing privacy against effectiveness, balancing this against that. You can't balance bias. Either it is doing good for the people who are at the most disadvantage in society, or it's perpetuating the status quo, which is inequality. So there is no balance. And this is a political as well as a business choice that companies have to make, that schools have to make when they integrate these tools. These are difficult choices. There's been some really great work by, for example, Pratisha Kalluri in Nature arguing, don't ask whether AI is good or fair, ask how it can shift power. And we follow this in our design principles, and we also think through some quite radical ethicists that look at algorithmic reparations. So literally this idea of reparations, which is still a conversation that we have at a heightened pitch in universities in the UK, and certainly in the pub in a Friday night or with your parents, whoever it might be. Reparations is something that is still very much an argument in the UK, and that's I think the level that we need to have this conversation about ethics. This is not some sort of wishy-washy holdy hands thing. Ethics is a really hard political discussion, and that's the level that it needs to be had. And then the other thing I wanted to say was that someone's talking about AI literacy in the chat. Literacy is so unsexy that even the government in the UK don't want to invest in it. It's the one thing that we could do to improve the way that the elections are handled in the UK is to improve AI literacy. But it doesn't garner the same kind of political support because it's deemed dull. So now we've started an education program at Cambridge, the centre that I work for, and actually I'd love to talk to some of you in relation to the work that we do there. But we've been now working with community centres. I think I was just getting annoyed at sort of my fellow academics that we teach at Cambridge, but we don't actually go and disperse this information anywhere else, and we're paid a lot of money by companies to go and speak to them. But it's been a real pleasure to go to students in a place in London near Grenfell, where there's an amazing community centre called Clement James, and through them we've been doing organising talks with young people and getting them involved. Partly because I really want young people in these areas of London to go and work in AI, because if someone has to earn a six-figure salary, I want it to be them. But I also want to connect different ideas about what is an AI engineer, what do they look like, but actually you can be a linguist, you can work for Dove and do advertising and beauty. If you're good at communications, you have comm skills, you can work for AI companies and do advertising, and just get people involved themselves. And then they can start having those conversations with their parents. So lots of practical ways of improving literacy. The other thing, there was something about transgender rights in the chat. Another thing that we're trying to do is get companies to think differently about gender. Why are you collecting information on someone's gender at all? is it relevant? Gender is not binary. Gender is not something that can be understood by an AI system. You cannot look at someone and tell their gender. You cannot look at someone and tell their sexuality, which is something that engineers at Stanford attempted to do. And once we go past the binary, then we can create systems, whether they're AI or not, that better understand and work with people and what they actually want from the world. So we use transgender ideas, but also queer theory in the way that we understand gender in relation to these tools. I think that was it. So yes, all those are part of feminist AI, saying AI is not neutral, it's not produced in a vacuum. It's created from knowledge that's extracted from somewhere. It cannot observe a face neutrally, objectively. That classical science idea that the world is an open book for us to read, that's dead. Quantum mechanics showed us that the observer and the apparatus of observation actually produces the world that is observed. So that's a very out-of-date statement for AI to make in this world of modern science.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Just mindful of the time, we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I want to just give all of you a quick moment to react to the kind of future of AI. If there are any, and I know we've brought some of these things out throughout the discussion, if there are any kind of lessons that you would leave for policymakers, quick kind of 2 minutes from each of you. Maybe Jeremy, I'll start with you in terms of lessons for policymakers that you would want to communicate to them.
Sure. The main message I would want to communicate to public policymakers is one, that there are these engineering processes we can use. I work in an institute that's developing AI technologies, and we have, for example, an educator advisory board. We have an equity board, and they're not involved just at the end saying, is this okay to be used in a school? They're involved in every stage of the design process. And so this co-design can be made real. And I think it's important to push for that. And the other comment I want to make is safety can't wait. So here in the US, and I'm not holding up the US as a particular example, I'm just talking about concretely the work I've been involved in. We've been looking at how can existing civil rights laws be applied to address algorithmic discrimination? How can laws about the evidence required to put a product into a school be applied to AI? And we've been looking at access problems, for example, digital equity in that regard. So there's a lot of laws on the books, also privacy and data security. There are laws on the books, and we can't wait for new laws. Safety can't wait. Every country should be looking at the laws it has and figuring out how to apply those right now to make this safe for our children.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Dr. Tanksley, over to you.
Okay, so I'm sitting here thinking about Black futurity and and this I feel like is, relevant to all of our students, right? But if these AI systems are being placed in our schools in order to provide, this better future, this idealistic future, this more equitable future, then those technologies also need to be saving our environment and not harming our environment. And I think a piece that often is overlooked when we're talking about like bias is bias that exists beyond the user and tool, right? So we're talking a lot about infrastructures and architectures, but we also need to look at the ecologies, the global ecologies, and I would say carceral imaginaries that surround these tech tools, right? So the data warehouses that are extracting and depleting fresh water sources in the midst of a global drought, right? The carbon footprint. An article just came out yesterday about the data centers in Ireland actually have a higher energy output than all of the homes in the urban center, right? What future can AI give us if it destroys our planet, right, before we get to that future? And so really thinking intentionally about environmental justice. I also think about the types of jobs. Eleanor, you kind of, what is the word I'm looking for? Suggested this. You made me think of this. But the types of jobs, right, that our students are going to have in AI, I similarly want them to be the architects of these systems, right, or the activists, or the CEOs and the venture capitalists and everything else. But time and again, we're seeing that the students who are in the schools with those carceral technologies, right, and the inequitable technologies are the ones who end up being our low-wage gig workers, right? The ones who are taking care of the data centers, the ones who are exposed to pollution, the ones who are, experiencing PTSD from doing content moderation, right? And so really thinking, I think, more broadly about what we mean when we're thinking about futurity, right? Is it just the individual student and their career path, right? Or is it this larger kind of ecosystem, this tech ecosystem? And then finally, I think about building with companies who are by and for marginalized communities that there's an app, I think it's Taimao. I probably messed that up, but it's a company that does indigenous data sovereignty, right? And AI for indigenous communities in Hawaii. We need to learn from companies like that, right? For this speculative future.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Tanksley. Eleanor, any last words from you?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. And actually, I can put some links in the chat. Those speculative future projects are so important because students are already bummed out enough. Like, it's a depressing world. They're not doing great. And, I really feel some moral obligation to be asking them, what kind of future do you want to live in? What do you want AI to look like? If you built an AI system within your family, do you think it would respond to your needs better than a system that Google might make? Would it share your values rather than, in a way that big tech would not? And it's about being creative. It's about working out what is good to them, and injecting some of that fun while also learning about that, the tech future that we're being sold is not an inevitable one. And, I really strongly contest techno-determinism, this idea that, well, if we don't build it, someone else will. If we don't start using it, someone else will force us to use it, or at some point we'll have to use it. And I really want students who have that creative engine to get involved in designing futures. That's what we've been doing for centuries. Utopianism is not, as Harari thinks it is, this terrible kind of blueprint that can always veer into fascism, although it sometimes does. Utopianism is about thinking with the difficulties of the present. It's a way of imagining what might be, what yet could be, based on the struggles and the things that we deal with in our day-to-day lives.
Thanks, Eleanor. Stefan, any last words from you?
Yes, perhaps I wanted to re-emphasize the question of co-creation and say that, we have developed with Education International, which is a federation of teacher unions, some tools that actually can start a discussion in many different countries on all these different things, and so, I really encourage you to have a look at that. There are already laws on equity in all countries. And so, the two last things I wanted to say is, one, it's very important for policymakers not to make it impossible to identify algorithmic bias. And the second, to become more practical about the laws on equity, and so that they're not just aspirational, but that they are actually followed by action. And for that, I think that it's very important to develop some types of routines to actually make sure that these things don't happen and that, there is some kind of verification, implementation process to, battle AI, unfairness, and when they have, the wrong algorithmic biases, etc., or bad use of AI in the classroom and in education systems.
Thanks, Stefan. Well, huge thanks to all of you. We're out of time, unfortunately. Really appreciate you joining from holiday, from different parts of the world. We had a great conversation today. Unfortunately, I wish we had more time. But check us out next week as well. We've got a webinar on AI in the classroom for teachers. So please join us for that. Emily has her own podcast, the Good Robot Podcast. You'll find that wherever good podcasts can be found. If you want to learn more about Jeremy's work, visit the Digital Promise website or visit engageai.org. And of course, check out our own podcast, Top Class, the OECD Education Podcast. Huge thanks to all of our panelists. Much appreciated. And all the best for the rest of you for a lovely summer, and hopefully you have a good summer vacation ahead. Thanks so much.